Good afternoon. I am Dr. Kerp, an associate professor in the Department of History at Ohio University and a fellow at our Contemporary History Institute. And I've been invited by the director of our institute, Dr. Ingo Trauschweitzer, to offer some reflections on Polish perspectives on the Russo-Ukrainian crisis and the West's response. I want to begin by talking about Poland's attitudes and perspectives on problems with Russia in the current crisis. Polish Russian relations have a very long history and a mostly conflicted, even tortured history since the 16th and 17th centuries. Much of the conflict between Poland and Russia actually was situated in Ukraine as both countries sought to exercise imperial dominance of this region. by the early by the mid 20th century, it appeared that Poland had decisively lost that conflict. After World War II, the Polish population in Ukraine was mostly expelled from the region, and Polish territories in Ukraine became part of Soviet Ukraine. And yet, within the last 2 decades of the 20th century, Soviet and Russian influence mostly collapsed in Ukraine, and the newly independent Polish governments after 1989 across the political spectrum tended to agree that Ukrainian independence was in Polish interest. As long as Russia was kept out of directly controlling Ukraine, the various countries in Central and Eastern Europe could had a greater potential to be free and secure than if Russia were to dominate these spaces. So this became an important cornerstone of Polish politics. Another thing to keep in mind is that even though Poland had had such a long history of conflict with Russia, there was initially high hopes in Poland in 1989 that Polish Russian relations could be put on an entirely different and positive footing. Those hopes began to fade even in the mid 90s before the Putin administration, as Poles saw in various initiatives of the Yeltsin administration the beginnings of a reassertion of Russian imperial interests throughout former Soviet spaces. And this began to alarm Poles even before Vladimir Putin began a much more open campaign of Russian imperial depredations. And pardon, my cat is beginning to assert its own territorial interest on the curtains behind me. So, anyway, Poles had throughout the early 21st century, again, across the political spectrum, begun to recognize that Russian ambitions regionally were a major problem and had attempted to sound the alarm to that effect with relatively little avail. So when the current crises became hotter, and really that has been a process that's begun over the last several years with the Russian incursions into Ukraine during the Maidan protests, the seizure of Crimea, and the Russian support for separatist movements in Donbass and eastern Ukraine. Poles were already situated where they had seen this pattern, were attempting to alert their Western collaborators to it, and understood that Putin's Russia was an expansionist regime. This was a rather awkward fit when it came to Polish Ukrainian relations, which are also quite tortured because Ukrainians have often had a certain hostility towards Poles as another imperial oppressor. Polish Ukrainian nationalist movements, in part, grew up as a response to perceived and actual efforts at Polish regional domination. And this bad blood led to a series of conflicts in the 20th century, culminating in the Rzeszwolynska, the Volhynian massacres or slaughter. in which Ukrainian nationalists, in collaboration with Nazi Germany, but not necessarily because Ukrainian nationalists were Nazis themselves, so there were strong fascistic tendencies in Ukrainian nationalism at this time. But Ukrainian nationalists were determined to drive Poles living in Ukraine out of Ukrainian spaces as a way of protecting Ukrainian sovereignty. And they did so through ethnic cleansing that often required a good deal of mass murder to make it stick. People don't just naturally pick up just because they're unwelcome in a place. It took real it took real violence to force Poles out of Ukraine. Poles also at times during this conflict responded with their own war crimes, though the Ukrainian nationalists had the upper hand for the most part. Tens of thousands of Polish refugees fled westward to areas of Poland, carrying with them stories of Ukrainian cruelty and murder that the communist government in Poland chose to amplify for its own reasons. And this further poisoned Polish Ukrainian relations. It's been only really in the last 20 or so years that we've seen the beginning of something like a healing of people to people relations, even though Polish statesmen, security analysts, etc., had recognized the importance of Ukrainian independence. It wasn't until the last 20 years, with increased Ukrainian immigration to Poland, that one begins and people to people contacts, and especially after 2014 and open Russian intervention in Ukraine, that you see a transformation in Polish Ukrainian social relations. The Ukrainian diaspora in Poland is working, and in other countries, has been working to protect Ukrainian interests and to advance Ukrainian perspectives, but has received a great deal of support from the Polish government, which has, I would argue, a half earned reputation as being hostile to immigrants. Certainly, many Polish governments reflecting Polish popular opinion do not want Middle Eastern immigration to their country in ways that has put them at odds with the European Union. However, in relation to Ukraine, Polish policies have been quite generous. Many of the Ukrainians living and working in Poland are there legally with the support of the Polish government. So we're seeing a turnaround in people to people relations, unfortunately, partly due to the shadow of Russian hostility. But there's another crisis that I want to speak very briefly of, and that is the crisis of Western confidence in Poland, Polish confidence in the West. If Poland is perceived as overly alarmist and hostile to Russia as such, from the Polish perspective, many Western countries have seemed dangerously and self interestedly indifferent to Russian predation. Germany, for instance, has for the most part pursued a policy that most Germans regard as de escalation with Putin's Russia and Putin's Belarusian, um, essentially puppet Lukashenko, in crises with the West. And this has caused a good deal of dismay in Poland, and also a recognition that German economic interests are being served in closer ties with Russia. That Germany, even though it is part of both the EU and NATO, is on the one hand proclaiming values of solidarity and sovereignty and democracy, on the other hand, working with a Russia that is is at times quite openly opposed to those values, not just for itself, but also for its neighbors, and also working on destabilizing those values, again, not just for itself and its neighbors, but even within the EU. The US has been another, for the most part, I would argue, a disappointment from the Polish perspective. Poles all across the political spectrum have striven to work well with the United States. At times, American policymakers in Washington have received this cooperation gratefully from Polish support in both US incursions into Iraq to our present policy in Ukraine. But American policies at times have caught the Polish government flat footed. So, for instance, the proposal that the US develop a missile shield in Eastern Europe was initially greeted with a certain reserve in Poland since it put them at risk, especially because Russia in 2004 to 2007 had made it known that it regarded any kind of missile shield, even if it was in primarily aimed towards protecting Europe from Iran, as being illegitimate. And you had Russians in official capacities threatening Poland with military action should it consent to building such a missile shield. The Polish government finally agreed to American initiatives in the aftermath of the Russian invasion of Georgia. And then the Obama administration, when it came into office, initially had said that it would go through with the missile shield, but then withdrew that offer at an especially bad day, the 17th of September, 2009, which was the 70th anniversary of the Soviet invasion of Eastern Poland in collaboration with the Nazis. In short, Poles saw in even American policy tensions between self proclaimed values, or even what one administration had regarded as strategic American and European interests, and the pursuit of those interests by other administrations. So I want to suggest we're looking at a variety of crises in Russia's place in Europe and Russian predation, particularly under the Putin regime, not just a crisis of Russian ambitions, but also a crisis of what should the Western response be, and our inability to collaborate effectively, not just Americans, but even within Europe. We see the same problems of collaboration. So these are issues well worth reflecting on. What are we seeking in our efforts to create a more secure global era, global peace, and period of collaboration?